Today, we will be discussing this very interesting dialect of Aramaic called Christian Palestinian Aramaic. Is it a form of Syriac? Is it its own language? What is it? Well, there are several different positions on the matter. As its name suggests, Christian Palestinian Aramaic, or CPA, as it's commonly known, is an Aramaic dialect used by Christians from the region of Palestine in between the 5th and 13th centuries of the Common Era. It looks a lot like Syriac. And in fact, in many ways, it's very easy to understand if one knows Syriac. And it's also, but unlike Syriac, which has an earlier date and lasts much longer. I mean, things are even composed today in Classical Syriac. Christian Palestinian Aramaic seems to have stopped as a writing system when it was no longer used as a spoken language. And I've seen some texts that have Arabic rubrics and then the CPA text in them. And these are mostly, it's called Christian Palestinian Aramaic because the corpus usually comes from Christians. And so it could have been used liturgically for a few centuries. If the community had started speaking Arabic in the Middle Ages, that's probably the case. I don't have enough data to say, and really I don't know that we can unless there's someone speaking about it or writing about it at that time. It's just really interesting that in other regions that had a heavy Arabic influence, Syriac persisted, but in the Holy Land, basically this is the region of Palestine and Transjordan. Here, we don't have a legacy of it. And so the funny thing is most of the texts we have are palimpsests. A palimpsest is when there's a text underneath something else, right? Because writing materials were reused in the ancient and classical worlds. And so sometimes what we find that was erased happens to be in CPA, in Christian Palestinian Aramaic. So it's a little bizarre, but it's kind of fun. And it's not quite the same as Syriac, even though it looks a lot like it. In fact, there's a couple different writing conventions. Just to name a couple of them, because there's even some extra letters. You have the phenomenon of Aleph, Hey, Waw, Salde, and Tau all joining on both sides, having medial characters. And so if you study Syriac, you know that they only join on the right side, but in CPA, they join on both. And that's kind of awkward. The shape of the script is very, it's almost a return to the block style, but maybe you could call it more geometrical. It seems to, instead of being like the classical Kitav Ashuri, the block script of Aramaic, it looks like it's influenced by Greek. And that makes sense because at this time you see a large, the growth from the 5th century onward of Greek Christianity in the region. And so one of the other features we have of Christian Palestinian Aramaic is the fact that it uses a lot of Greek loanwords. There's a lot more Greek in CPA than there is in Syriac. I mean, Syriac has tons of loanwords, whether they're Greek. They even have Latin loanwords, plenty of Persian loanwords, so many so that people forget that, that they've been around in Syriac probably for 500, plus years before Syriac is even a written language. And so the interesting thing about CPA is it seems to utilize a lot of Greek. The language I could compare it to is Coptic. So if you have heard the word Coptic before, Coptic is another way of saying Egyptian. And it's the living legacy of the ancient Egyptian language, except it's written in a modified version of the Greek script with some extra demotic characters. Demotic is a form of the alphabet or it's a form of the Egyptian writing system that is quite late. And so some sounds that are present in the ancient Egyptian language are not present in Greek, and so Coptic uses those. Well, if you've ever studied Coptic, you find, wow, this is a funky, language. It's really different. But I know a lot of the vocabulary because I see a lot of Greek popping up almost everywhere. And especially if it's like liturgical stuff or, Alexandrian Christian material, you're going to have that Greek interaction. And so there's a a good reason why there's a lot of Greek terminology in it. So that's how Coptic is. I think CPA kind of feels like that. It's just a hunch, right? Where you start reading and you're like, you know what? That's a Greek word. That's a Greek word. That's a Greek word. But it's in these, modified characters. So let's just take a look at a couple verses here. There's a lot of texts we can look at, and maybe if people are interested in, want to comment for more of this, let me know, and I'll pull some more out. You don't have a lot. You basically get people who do Syriac doing the CPA work, right? Because that's the closest language. And so we're just going to look at a couple of verses here, and I'm going to compare the Syriac with the Christian Palestinian Aramaic. And by the way, when I say Christian Palestinian Aramaic, right, like there's also a Jewish Palestinian Aramaic and a Samaritan, Aramaic. Why is that? Well, it's not that the languages are in and of themselves religious. It's that these communities who use them, they have their own verbiage. They have their own style and way of speaking. And that's actually quite normal. I mean, even in modern Aramaic, in Northeastern Neo-Aramaic or Surith or Assyrian, however we want to refer to the language, in the town of Zakho in northern Iraq, there's a Jewish way of speaking and a Christian way of speaking. You can kind of figure out who's affiliated with what community based on their accent or, the words that they use. And that's not too different from other places in the US. I mean, you can live in a certain city and maybe one group of people lives on one side of town and they have a certain rhythm or accent when they speak. If they were to write that out specifically, then you can probably figure it out. I mean, if we just don't write English that way, right? We kind of have a standard English and we don't write out the way we always speak. So turning now to the comparison, let's look at Psalm 2, verse 7. I'm going to read the Syriac first and then the CPA right after it. And just look below, and you can kind of see how the alphabets are same but different, right? And maybe to the untrained eye, they look quite different. But, if you just kind of blur your eyes a little and you've learned to read a Strangelo, this is not so different at all. So let's go ahead and read. We have Morio e Marli. The berat, weno yamono yeledtok. The Lord said to me, you are my son, today I've begotten you. Pretty similar in the Christian Palestinian Aramaic. And I'm not entirely sure how it's pronounced, whether it's Mara Amarli, Berat, Hu wa ana yomdin, Yeldithyatach. That's my guess without the Northwest shift. It's going to sound something like that. Now let's just compare the way they're spelled. In Syriac, you have a couple differences. You have the way in which Yahweh is conveyed in Syriac as Morio. In Christian Palestinian Aramaic, you have Moro, Lord. And that's interesting because a lot of, if not all, I'm just hesitating to say all because I don't know enough to say all, but most of, if not all, Christian Palestinian Aramaic is a translation from Greek. So here, the Christian Palestinian Aramaic word for Lord is actually the regular word for Lord, like kurios. And the Syriac word parallels the Hebrew text and says Morio, which would be Yahweh. Emarli is the same. And then we have this clause marker that dalat is used at. It's a relative particle, but it can mark a clause. And it's basically the same after that. Berat, CPA version, just spells it the way it sounds. That's not too different than Hebrew, right? Hebrew will just be aleph tau. For you. And in Syriac, you have a nun in the middle. It literally ant, but we don't say the nun. It's kliktho. It's dropped or lost. And so we say at, right? It's a silent letter. And then there's a couple differences beyond that. I mean, if you look at the word for today, you have yaumono in Syriac, yaumohono, versus yomden, like dana, right? So you have a different way of articulating the word for this and thus today. And then something fun happens between the Syriac and the CPA. The CPA, the Christian Palestinian Aramaic, uses this form that in Syriac is pretty antiquated. You see it in Akkadian, you see it in Hebrew. In Hebrew, you know it as et, right? So this is otcha in Hebrew, but yathach in CPA is just the direct object marker with the second person singular, masculine singular pronoun at the end. Here, that is just affixed to the verb in the Syriac, but in CPA, you have it following the verb as its own particle, which is pretty cool. You see it a little bit in Syriac translations of the Bible and sometimes, in the commentaries of the fathers, but it seems to have been antiquated even in their time, so it doesn't get used as much. Now let's go ahead and look at Luke chapter 9, verse 38. Again, I'm just selecting these sort of at random. We could do an analysis of a text sometime if people are interested. So the Syriac starts Ugabro had and some guy and a man to say. That doesn't show to be present in the CPA edition, so that's why I sort of darkened it in the Syriac above. Then I'll go ahead and read. من كنشو هو قعو وعمار مالفونو بوعينو منوق إثبني علي بير يهيدويو هولي. And a man from the crowd cried out and said, Teacher, I beseech you, turn yourself to me. Here is my only son. Similar in the CPA, we have mingu. Instead of just min, it's mingo, which go means inside, right? Mingo occluso asiah ومر مالفونو ومر مالفانا أنا بقى منخ أدمي ببير وهولي يحيدي. So similar, but not quite the same. There's a couple dialectical features there that we see more prominent in CPA. Just real quick, again, to show the construction, how some things are a little different, some are the same. The CPA has the word for in the crowd. It has go. Syriac doesn't. Syriac says, he says. The he is just dropped from the CPA. And then a couple other, particle markers here. Now, the word for the crowd or the assembly, those people who are gathered in Syriac kensho, but ochluso in CPA. Ochluso probably from ochlos in Greek, from the crowd or the group of folks, the throng, the mass, something like that. Even karo in Syriac is asih in CPA. So that's another way to say cry out or yell or something of that nature. Then this funny thing, you have Boeno in Syriac versus Anabae. You have just a flip of the script. And I wonder if that's paralleling the Greek. That's something I have not looked into, but that would be my hunch, not knowing more about, the construction of the active participles here, because it's an active participle in Syriac. And usually, even in Hebrew, traditionally, the pronoun's going to follow the verb, but it doesn't have to. There's that little flip. Then we have a different choice of verbs for turn yourself toward me. And this fun word in Christian Palestinian Aramaic is admi-ba. And it comes from the root the Maya or the me, to be like, right? To appear in the likeness of something. So kind of like look at, right? Perceive. Interesting use of that. And then at the end, you do have this flip, of Syriac is the Yahidoyo Huli, and then you have the Huli Yahidi in CPA. So it's basically the same word. There's just no aleph at the end in CPA like there is in Syriac. Whether the word is just Yahid with a possessive yod or it's just in the absolute form, that's something we can investigate further. So that's our little introduction to Christian Palestinian Aramaic and how it relates to Syriac. I think the subject matter is a lot easier to understand if you've done Syriac first, or even you're just exposed to Syriac. If you start looking at CPA right away, there's a bunch of question marks, right? There's a bunch of holes in the conversation, sort of like studying Neo-Assyrian Akkadian, right? The Neo-Assyrian dialect of Akkadian before studying Old Babylonian. Old Babylonian is pretty concise, it's clear, it's easy, it's functional, and then you start getting into the dialectical stuff. I think CPA should be considered a dialect of the greater, call it Syriac realm, whether we want to call it Western Aramaic or not, that's fine. That's just classifying vocabulary and region and, what things appear similar or what forms even show up that are similar by geographical region or time, things like that. But really, they're not so different. It's kind of like, the people speaking Aramaic or a version of Syriac in the region where Greek is very dominant may sound like this, as opposed to those people who are, in Syria and beyond, in Iraq and Southeast Turkey and Iran, even places like this, where you don't have as much Greek interaction. Yeah, there's Greeks there, sure. And in fact, the closer to the coast you get, there's Greeks, but it's not like the Holy Land where there's a major political presence. And so that could be shaping this whole thing. Thanks so much for watching. And if you have any questions or comments, don't hesitate to let me know. Fushun Bashlomo. Remain in peace.